Spectrovision Radio.
For early access to ad-free episodes, visit patreon.com/WNMTK podcast. I'm what's known as an urban explorer. I access abandoned places and make videos about my adventures. My channel was doing okay, but I was taken by surprise by just how hard it is to get anyone to show up or care. It was only when I realized that the episodes exploring supposedly haunted places were the ones getting more of a reaction, and I started focusing on those, that it began to take off in any real way. When I say real, I don't mean that in any financial sense. But, numbers-wise, people were watching. People were commenting. People seemed like they might actually care. So I lent into it more and more. And before I knew it, I'd basically rebranded as an investigator of spooky abandoned spots. The myths, legends, and rumors behind them became as important as the places themselves. I became part adventurer, part storyteller. But I soon began to notice a downward trend. Viewers always expected something to happen that inevitably never did. Some kind of hint that there really might be something truly frightening about those discarded, forgotten locations. Something that I should have been able to offer them a glimpse of, no matter how impossible that seemed. "These are starting to get boring," one comment said. "Every video is the same, all build up and no climax," said another. "Snore, unsubscribed," proclaimed another user. I wanted to tell them that it was real life, that I couldn't make something happen as if I was simply creating fiction. But then I realized that that wasn't strictly true. I thought back to my teenage years, that wonderful time when the found footage genre got its start, and millions of people genuinely believed the completely constructed narratives they were watching were actually real, that they'd somehow been given access to something that was never meant to be seen. I went back and watched some of the ones I remembered being particularly good, and was surprised to find how well they still held up. Visceral, raw, and yes, very real. I started doing some research, wanting to understand how they'd achieved that disintegration of artifice, and I discovered a common theme. The trick was to make it so the actors didn't know what was coming. No real plan, no rehearsal. Those behind the camera would subject those in front of it to things they were not expecting. So, in terms of their reaction, the things that were happening might as well have been real. I called my friend Pete and got him to meet me for a coffee. Pete was what I'd suppose you'd call an aspiring filmmaker, but it seemed to be mostly aspiring and very little making. He seemed convinced the universe would simply realize he was special, and that the right people would come looking for him, knock on his door and exclaim, "Ah, there you are. We've been looking for someone as brilliant as you. Come with us for fame and fortune." With his inflated sense of self, it was no real surprise that he turned his nose up at the horror films I used as references when I told him about my idea. "I want you to make a plan of what you're going to subject me to over the course of that night," I said, ignoring his pretentiousness, "but not tell me what that plan is." The more I talked, the more I could see him start to come round, even if only slightly. It was probably the sense that he'd be in complete control that was doing it. Eventually, once I laid it on thick that I believed we could make something that could really catch fire online, maybe even get him noticed, he agreed to do it, provided we split the revenue the video generated. I agreed and shook his hand, keeping to myself the fact that we might each walk away with enough only to buy one more coffee, like the ones we drained while talking. "So where are we doing this?" Pete asked, and I had only one place in mind. England is a lot of things, both good and bad. But one thing's for sure, as a terrain, it's saturated in historical lore to the point of being impossibly detailed. It means that the truth is often lost to legend, and for those who love a mystery whose secrets have been buried by the sands of time, it's a bottomless pit of wonder. Nowhere did that seem more true to me than Racton Ruin in West Sussex. Built between 1766 and 1775 at the behest of the second Earl of Halifax, the structure was probably intended as a lavish summer house or a vantage point to observe merchant ships docking at the port of Emsworth. Standing around 24 meters tall, the castle-like structure features a perfectly cylindrical base, round turrets on each side, and a central tower 4 floors in height. Less kind legends suggest it was a front, and that it was really used as a vantage point to guide in smugglers from the nearby coast. Others claim that the banquets it hosted were really debauched, orgiastic parties where all kinds of boundary-pushing pursuits of pleasure took place. Whatever the case, its owner, for reasons unknown, ordered it to be demolished in 1782, but its destruction was only partly carried out, leaving it mostly intact. The reasons for its destruction being called off have also been lost to time. Today, it stands as a ghostly, decaying shell of its former self, and many have appropriated that space for their own ends. Between its strangely brief heyday and the present, the ruin has seen it all. Occult rituals, illegal raves, suicides, and strange phenomena experienced by those who visit. A sense of peculiar disorientation, hearing disembodied voices, even seeing a floating face at the window. But looking back on its history, one glaring question stares back from the dark unknowability of the past. Why would the owner, who'd spent all that time and money constructing it, order it to be demolished just 7 years after having it built? What could possibly be so wrong with the place? The evening I arrived there, the sky was thick with a grey carpet of clouds. Hiking up the muddy path from where I'd left my car, it didn't take long for me to spot the ruin on the horizon, so I grabbed my phone and recorded a short clip of my approach. There was something pre-Christian and Druid-like about it that set it apart from the architecture of the time. No right angles, everything rounded to keep the main structure and its side chambers circular. At the top of the ascent, I scuttled through some overgrown bushes and found myself right in front of it. With its central tower looming above me, I hit record again and climbed in through one of its gaping, painless windows. I spent the next hour exploring the place, delivering short monologues to camera on its history and on my plans to spend a night inside it, alone. The only thing I found of my initial sweep of the place, aside from the debris left by others like me, was a noose hanging in one of its chambers, swaying ever so slightly in the breeze. It was a striking image, sure, but as I mused about it aloud to my future audience, I secretly hoped that wasn't the full extent of whatever it was Pete had planned. Once I'd made my way through all of its rooms, I set up in its main chamber for the night, which sat like a pit below the floor level of the other chambers. I laid down a blanket, my sleeping bag atop it, and set up a portable light, placing several cameras around the place to record the whole experience. Darkness was slow to fall, partially thanks to where the ruin's round roof would once have been, now being only a perfectly circular hole giving way to the sky above. But once it did, and I was left in the stillness of the night, broken only by that breeze pushing the trees of the surrounding foliage, I quickly found myself running out of things to say, my musings becoming more and more trite, and I felt myself growing somewhat bored. But just when I was worried that it would be a total washout and that Pete had stood me up, things started to get going. I heard a shuffling sound behind me. I turned to see that a pale, scruffy man, in a drab, ill-fitting black suit and an expressionless face, was staring at me from inside one of the smaller chambers. I deduced that he must have climbed in through the window in that room, on the opposite side of the ruin from where I'd gained access. "Hello there," I said. His face remained stoical. "It would be wise to not let him see you like this," he said flatly. Unsure what to make of him, whether he was a random nutter or someone doing Pete's bidding, I kept my calm. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying not to sound overly confrontational. "He's trying to see you," the man replied. He lifted a scrawny arm and pointed past me. I followed the invisible line from his finger and turned my head to see what he was signaling at. But there was nothing there. Just a brick wall covered in moss and faded tags left by a less than gifted graffiti artist. But when I turned back around to face the man, he was gone. "Hello?" I called out, genuinely confused. There was no reply, only utter silence. I scrambled to my feet and hoisted myself over the small ledge and entered the chamber he'd been in. In that small circular room, there was nowhere to hide, and it was empty. I approached the window and looked out into the night, concluding that he must have quickly and skillfully climbed out of the window when I looked away, and then he must have then gone into the forest, now keeping out of sight. I was slightly bemused by how exactly he'd done it. But for the cameras, I played up the supposed impossibility of that feat, proclaiming aloud how there was no way he could have gotten out that quickly and silently. Not a bad start, Pete, I thought to myself. Not bad at all. Excited for what was to come, and that Pete might really pull something special off, I headed back to my spot in the main chamber, and riffed on the experience out loud, wanting to capture my immediate reaction for the audience, commenting on the peculiarity of the man's tired clothes and the lack of light in his eyes. But as the thrill began to wear off, sitting there in silence once more, I began to ruminate. It had been a short performance, but the man had been convincing. I hoped he was a friend of Pete's, doing it for a laugh, and that I wasn't going to get an inflated invoice by some actor who fancied himself the next big thing. 1 in, 1 out. I snapped out of my spiraling thoughts and span on the spot to look over my shoulder, convinced I'd heard whispering. 1 in, 1 out. There it was again, but where was it coming from? The circular structure created the strangest effect. I turned my head towards where the voice sounded like it was coming from, only for it to then sound as if it had moved. I declared this out loud, exaggerating how disorienting it was for the cameras, and rushed through the rooms, stating that I was chasing its trail. I silently wondered if I'd have to pretend not to see small wireless speakers Pete may have planted, and how much of a pain it would be to edit out any sight of them later. But I saw nothing of the sort as I scrambled through the vacant rooms. The whispers soon stopped, and I wandered around for a while, speaking to camera, now also whispering to myself to keep up the sense that I might not be alone, that something else may be listening, hoping to elicit an exciting sense of trepidation for my eventual audience. But in all honesty, part of me was slightly unnerved. Again, I was struck by just how convincing Pete's execution had been thus far. I didn't understand how he'd achieved the effect. That's the point, I told myself. Remember what you told him about all those found footage films. You're not meant to know. But a different sound came, before I could consider it any further. A sequence of deafening cracks, like a whip cracking the air, over and over. "Can you hear that?" I said aloud, and I realized I was no longer talking to my future audience. I was rattled enough that the idea I wasn't alone, that someone might be sharing this experience with me, felt like a small comfort. Bloody hell, Pete, I thought. And then the cracking sound gave way to something else, something which genuinely made me freeze and feel every muscle in my body clench. I heard wailing, loud, unmistakable moans, and there was no doubt in my mind that they were human. Paralyzed there, listening to them bounce off the walls, I couldn't tell if they were expressing pleasure or pain. It ended abruptly, mid-cry, in a way which deeply unsettled me. I felt vulnerable, scared, regretting what I'd set in motion. In that moment, I was tempted to start shouting for Pete to call it off. I didn't like this. It was too experiential. I suddenly realized that those found footage films I loved, though brilliant, may have also been cruel, something I'd read about online but had chosen to ignore. If this was how they got results, it felt too real. And then there was only silence. I did my best to quash the fear coursing through me, and resisted the urge to put an end to the whole thing. I forced myself to take a series of deep breaths. You asked for this, I told myself. You know what it is, and just think of how good the footage will be. One night of discomfort has to be worth it. Somewhat placated, I once again made my way back to the central chamber. And when I stepped before its threshold, I saw that there was someone in there, illuminated by my portable light. It was a different man to the one I'd spoken to before. This man was more plump, with floppy hair that draped over his brow, and he was dressed in a strange but somewhat lavish-looking pinstripe suit. "Hi there," I said tentatively. He nodded, offered a polite smile. "Greetings," he said, seemingly unalarmed at the prospect of encountering a stranger in the night. "I assume you're here because, like me, you're also fascinated by this remarkable place." He was immediately more obviously performative than his predecessor, and I was caught in two minds. Part of me was glad, feeling exhausted by how convincing everything else had been. But part of me still hoped his acting wouldn't be too expositional, still eager to come out of this with something special for the audience. The man turned his head and I realized he was contemplating a section of graffiti on the chamber wall. "Shame that," I mumbled, unsure of what else to say. "Quite the opposite," he replied confidently. "This is a place of expression, even the kinds others might deem destructive." The old-fashioned manner in which he spoke betrayed his thespian roots, but I had to admit that he too was fairly convincing, taking the role seriously in a way which seemed utterly committed and devoid of any sense of pretend. Where did Pete find these people? I wondered. I took the risk of probing, curious if his improvisational skills were up to it. "One thing's always stuck with me," I said, my voice calmer now. "Why would the man who spent all that time and money building this place then try to have it destroyed?" He took his time searching for a response, and I worried that it meant I'd hit the limits of his ad-libbing qualities. But when he spoke again, he was measured and certain. The creator of this place tried to destroy it, because he realized it had been co-opted by other forces. "What does that mean?" I said, finding myself genuinely intrigued and momentarily losing sight of the fact that this was basically a game, not truly real in the purest sense. He turned back towards me and smiled a slightly manic, wide-eyed smile. "Do you ever wish the good times just never stopped?" he asked. I didn't reply, uncertain what the best response would be, and let him carry on with his monologue. "The founder of this place," he continued, "he hosted many people at his parties, but it took one particular guest to see its true potential." With that, he slowly began to make his way in my direction, and I unintentionally flinched, taking a scuffed step backwards. "My name is Julian," he said, closing in on me and offering his hand. Gingerly, I reached out and took it, and was struck by the firmness of the shake. "Ed," I said in return. "Tell me, Ed, would you like me to really show you this place?" he asked. I stared back at him, not following, and asked him what that meant. He started to open his mouth to reply, and then he was someone else entirely. In the blink of an eye, I was no longer staring back at the man who told me his name was Julian. I was staring back at the man I'd seen earlier that night, the one who'd warned me that someone was trying to see me. "Run," he exclaimed. "Leave before it's too late." And then, as quickly as he'd appeared, he was gone, and I was looking back at Julian again. I let go of his hand and shifted backwards until I felt my back hit the brick ledge behind me. "What's the matter?" Julian asked, seemingly genuinely concerned. "Fuck this," I thought. I turned and vaulted up the ledge and ran into one of the back chambers, planning to escape via the window. Rushing down the corridor with my thudding footsteps echoing wildly as I ran, the place began to fill with smoke, and became so thick I couldn't see properly, couldn't navigate my way to my escape route. But it wasn't the kind of smoke you get from a fire. It was whiter, somehow, and smelled resinous and sweet. I felt a strange rush through my body, a slight relaxation as I unintentionally drew lungfuls of it into my body. I began to slow, feeling lightheaded, until I was unable to run any longer, and I found myself standing unsteadily, staring into that thick smoke, with no real sense of where I was anymore. And then I saw something. A face, but not of a human. A fox, I thought. But as the smoke began to thin out and my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't that. No, not a fox. A person. A person wearing a fox mask. They stood over 6 feet tall, donning some kind of crimson-red robe, and they were holding what I quickly realized was a leash. It was one long lead attached to 3 collars. Collars which were fastened tightly around the necks of 3 people, who were naked on all 4s. They looked up at me through dead eyes, eyes that had been robbed of something. I stood there, unable to move, stupefied by what I was seeing, as the person in the fox mask yanked the leash, and its 3 human pets followed obediently, eyes now cast down at the ground, movements routine, but broken. "Where are you?" I heard a voice call out, and there was no doubt in my mind it belonged to Julian. "Where are you?" he cried again, his tone insistent and tinged with what sounded to me like danger. I felt myself regain some control over my swaying limbs and forced my mind to focus. I pushed my arms out in front of me and swayed them side to side as quick as I could, trying to waft away the smoke and clear a path. And all the while, I could hear Julian's thumping footsteps as he searched for me, the sound bouncing around in a way which meant I had no idea how close he was or from which direction he was coming. I kept swinging my arms, moving tentatively forward on my feet now, growing so utterly desperate. And then I saw it, one of the ruins' windows, up ahead. The pitch black of night beyond it had never looked so welcoming. I pushed myself to run with all my might, and threw myself clumsily out of it, hitting the ground outside with a heavy scrape that burned my skin and sent a soaring pain through me. But I didn't care. I shambled to my feet and ran as fast as I could. And I didn't dare look back. It took me a few days to calm down and stop my imagination from running wild. Of course Pete had been behind it all. He'd just been far, far better at executing our plan than I could have possibly predicted. He'd successfully worked me up into such a frenzy that the genuine terror I'd felt had caused my mind to play tricks on me. With all the adrenaline and cortisol running through my body, I'd basically put my nervous system into overdrive and had essentially hallucinated. I had a new empathy for people lost in the woods who are convinced that they saw Bigfoot, or ghosts, or aliens. In that scared, suggestible state, those things can appear completely genuine. Simple as that, I thought. Terrifying, but explainable through simple psychology. It was 3 days after the incidents of that night that I ventured back to the ruin, this time on a sunny morning. Luckily, my equipment was still there, and I gathered it up as quick as I could, the daylight spilling in through the open roof only offering so much comfort. Once I was fully recovered, I called Pete, wanting to congratulate him and get him to give me a peek behind the curtain and see how he'd actually pulled it all off, telling myself I'd leave out the part about how he'd essentially got me to temporarily lose my mind. "I hope you're not too angry with me," he said, once I got a hold of him after trying to call several times. I said the opposite. I was utterly gobsmacked by what he'd done. That it had been, for want of a better word, incredible. He remained silent on the line, not responding to the compliment, and I realized he was probably worried he'd pushed me too far. "Pete, what you pulled off was amazing," I said. "No hard feelings. I haven't edited the footage yet, but I can tell you now it was totally worth it." I waited for some kind of reaction, and he took an age to respond. "Ed, I didn't do anything. I was apologizing because I totally dropped the ball. I got sick and I just didn't do anything. I'm sorry." I laughed and told him I appreciated his commitment to keeping up the ruse. "You only needed to make it feel real for me while it was happening," I said. Pete sighed heavily down the line and told me he wasn't putting on an act, and once again apologized. The rest of the conversation became a strange back and forth where neither of us gave any ground. I kept telling him to cut it out, that it was over, that we'd done it, and he kept insisting he'd done nothing, that he had no idea what I was talking about, and that he was sorry. I went through all the footage. Both the men I'd seen appeared, Julian and the unnamed man who I'd remembered telling me to run. My conversations with them were recorded, clear as day. But there was no moment when Julian suddenly became the other man. The footage instead showed me suddenly screaming the words, "Run, leave before it's too late," and then scrambling away from Julian. Likewise, none of the footage showed any smoke filling the chambers. No man in a fox mask with his 3 leashed followers. But I was able to find one other thing. I dug into the audio and was able to locate one of the whispers I thought I'd heard. After a lot of searching for tips online, I managed to amplify it enough that I thought I could make out what it said. 1 in, 1 out. I uploaded the edit. It didn't catch fire in the way it might have. I'm not sure why. Maybe things only ever feel truly real if you're there, and simply watching can only ever offer so much. Or maybe I didn't properly feed the algorithmic beast I barely understand. But I couldn't care less about that now. Pete never changed his story. I pushed him to the point that it made things weird between us, ruined our relationship. But he stuck to his guns, insisting he'd let me down that night. Hadn't planned anything. Hadn't done a single thing. But I can picture that man in the fox mask, his subservient, dehumanized subjects on leashes, on all fours at his heel. And when I do, it's indistinguishable from any other memory I possess. As real as the things I know absolutely did happen. So, when all is said and done, what does that really mean? That's what I can't get over. The not knowing. Did Pete pull off some kind of masterpiece? And he's just still playing a role in insisting he had nothing to do with it? Or was it... well, I don't know.